I think barring the first couple of years where the banner rates were kind of inconsistent, FEH's been pretty good at printing a lot of new characters for pretty much every single month. We end up getting about 11 to 12 per month, which is a pretty decent amount, even though nowadays a lot of them are just kind of treading on alts, or I guess you could argue that more than half, because now the new hero banners are more like, here are the new hero, not plural, but because of the frequency of all these banners, we will occasionally get one that ran maybe a year ago or maybe even like 10 months ago show back up on the same week that the brand new heroes are already running on, just because they got lucky enough to come back that early. And it's interesting looking at these revivals nowadays because they're a lot more cutthroat than they were arguably back then, to the point where you're kind of lucky if a banner will stick around for more than 2 polls. Usually that isn't that much the case nowadays, but if you're bringing up 2020 or 2021 standards for banners, then that's a whole different story. There was a revival banner that lasted up to 9 polls, which was at least over a year by that point. And I want to talk about it because it's kind of funny, but also really sad. And I mean, it's mostly funny, but sometimes it's kind of sad. Just how long it lasted, just for the sake of it. This is the FEH banner that, well, it wouldn't fuck off. Well, I can't put that in the YouTube title, so it's probably going to be something different. But yeah, it stuck around for a pretty damn long time. And, you know, before we can at least get to that point, I want to go back and talk about the first revival, because that one didn't have a poll to my knowledge. I was looking through pretty much all the archives to see if I could find any information on this, because compare, contrast a bunch of banners to the revivals and what was really there, what wasn't really worth voting for, blah, 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 blah. And I couldn't find anything for the first one. And I think it's just because there wasn't a poll whatsoever. And then when I found out what ended up running the first time around for a Forging Bonds revival, I wasn't exactly surprised because it was the debut 3 Houses banner. And I mean, no matter what it was up against, it was just going to win anyway, which I'm not complaining. It was a pretty decent banner. But looking back at that, I realized there probably wasn't a poll regardless, because the first time we ever got a poll, at least from what I am seeing, it was based on the 4 banners that came after the initial 3 Houses banner, which pretty much confirms it to me at least. Or maybe I didn't look in the right places. Either way, I'm going to just say it didn't have a revival. And that would also line up with just how revivals kind of function in general, where you get the 4 banners that are up for a vote. Obviously, the winner will end up getting revived and then reran. The one that gets last place, though, with the least amount of votes, will just get entirely scrapped from the voting process. But the 2 remaining banners that ended up getting 2nd or 3rd will always just stick around until they either get 1st place or last place. And most of the time, they just end up getting last place at the end of the day. But that's generally just how revivals function in terms of what gets in and what gets out. And it's usually a 2 banner cycle every single time. And I think that's just how they maintain the pacing, because revivals also take place every 2 months. So generally you'll get about 6 per year, and accompanying Forging Bonds, because, you know, it's a Forging Bonds revival. It's in the name, you know? And because it started out with the last 4 banners of book 3, it wouldn't really take that long for the Mirabilis banner to really get into the mix of all of it. It would be about 4 polls between July of 2020 and January of 2021 where it would initially make its debut. And for what the banner was, it didn't do too poorly even on debut. In fact, it did pretty well for the most part. However, this is probably where it would peak in its votes, if not maybe a couple polls after that, mostly because a lot of the banners that ended up winning after these polls were significantly better in a lot of aspects. The banner itself was very much hard carried by Mirabilis, which, you know, funny anima mythic dancer who's pretty good even to this day. Everything else on it just wasn't really that great for the most part, barring maybe some fodder potential that you could have gotten out of a couple units. You had Awakening Anna, who as a unit really wasn't that good, but she did have pretty good fodder. And to be frank, I could probably describe both normal 5-star heroes as that alone. Sari was probably a lot worse because she had a conditional distant counter weapon, which was based on a really bad condition, but she had a pretty good A slot for inheritance, and she had a pretty good B slot for inheritance as well. Mustafa was pretty much just your generic demo who brought basically nothing to the game besides maybe a funny axe that you could use, maybe. I don't know. It wasn't really really that great. Not to mention Sari was color sharing with Mirabilis, so that made it a bit of a harder sell. Even so, it was a sparkable mythic on a normal heroes banner, which was not very common and pretty valuable in its own right. But it just didn't really have that much of a push comparatively to what was winning after the fact. Even so far as the debut banner itself, where the Chris banner pretty much just curb stomped it because you had an infantry sword and an infantry lance that were just leagues better than arguably 2 duds at the end of the day. Also, that reminded me, Sari debuted with her Japanese voice only, but considering when that happened, yeah, maybe not so fun fact. Still, there wasn't a mythic. If anything, was the key factor in keeping Mirabilis around for as long as she was. Until it got to a point where it was just kind of memeing, but I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself at the moment. Regardless, it wasn't inherently bad, especially if you were to consider everything else that was around that period of time, which is also why it ended up lasting as long as it did. For pretty much every other banner that they would add, it would kind of stick around either 2nd or 3rd place, sometimes to the point where it was barely teetering over 4th place with maybe a couple hundred votes here and there. But the amount of other banners that they would add into the mix were just really mediocre, to the point where there was a clear winner and then there was a clear loser, and none of those were ever the Mirabilis banner. Clear winners could have easily been something like Choose Your Legends 4, which pretty much had all the super popular Three Houses characters on it. Although it's funny looking through all of these because most of the winners were Three Houses banners, and part of that was probably because a lot of them were either really good or they were from Three Houses. And I mean, I couldn't really blame people for that. It was the hot game at the time. Made complete sense. Everything else, however, didn't really have the same staying power, which is really crazy when you consider that it was a single defense mythic that was really doing all that heavy lifting. A lot of the other characters that ended up coming on these revival polls just weren't that inherently good, especially when compared to a banner that came out maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, over a year ago. You had stuff like the Fates banner with Lilith and Rinka and Midori, and outside of Midori being a pretty good fodder bot because her bow was insanely good at the time, most of them really didn't have anything worthwhile. You had other stuff like Binding Blade, which was a pretty mediocre banner for the most part. You had some pretty decent fodder, but then you also had stuff like Melody and Merlinus that just weren't good in the slightest, and whatever other 5 stars that were there to compensate did not make up for the fact that you had Mirabilis on another banner just right over there, which is also why they completely got curb stomped. And then, you know, you also have your standard Thracia banner, which it's Thracia, so it's automatically bad and dead. Although, I mean, to be fair, it also wasn't really that great of a banner anyway, but it did get interesting because we did end up getting another mythic on these polls. It just didn't matter though, because they ended up winning immediately, unlike the Mirabilis banner that I just keep bringing up because that's the center point of the video. But you know, otherwise it's still more Three Houses and other mediocre banners that honestly in some aspects were so much worse than whatever banner could have even come out in the prior books. Most notably being something like the Genealogy of the Holy War banner, where pretty much everybody wasn't that great and the fodder options weren't really that good, because that was also the period of time where they would start selling a bunch of 5 stars with arena scoring skills, which ended up meaning nothing at the end of the day. It helped some for a slight period of time, but as BSC kept going up and up and up, the skills became even more worthless. And it would just keep going on and on and on and on and on, to the point where even the Path of Radiance banner would also just stick around, just because the other options were either just so good that he would automatically win, or so bad that he would automatically lose. So even for a period of time, you had another banner that was just stuck in that period of limbo. But if this were a video on the Path of Radiance banner, I probably would have brought it up more, and it probably wouldn't have gotten kicked out as fast as it did. And at that point, we were already getting through midpoints of Book 5 banners and anything that came after that, and the midpoint for Book 4 was just kind of sticking around because, surprisingly, nothing really was competing with it. I would argue by this point, though, where we started getting midpoint for Book 5, is when the Book 4 midpoint banner was really overstaying its welcome, but it also did have that bit of a meme factor going on because of how long it was lasting, and it inevitably became a goal, quote unquote, just to keep it around to see how long it could really last. It got to the point where people were genuinely considering seeing if the poll could end up getting to the point where Mirabilis would end up getting a remix and the option would still be available. Spoilers, it didn't happen, but it ended up still lasting a fair bit of time, even to the point where I would still argue it overstayed its welcome because we were getting better Book 5 banners, arguably, that ended up getting kicked out instead. It got so long to the point where we had 2 Choose Your Legend cycles through these revival polls before it would get kicked out. You'd still have other Book 5 banner options around, but at this point, it was really just kind of there for the meme because everything else was just arguably better by that point. And I think a lot of people also knew this because the amount of votes between 3rd place and 4th place, where the Awakening banner was just kind of occupying, was barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things. But then we get to poll number 13, and this is where the streak ends. After 9 consecutive polls where it would just stick around and it wouldn't go away or do anything else but take up a slot for another banner that could have arguably been used up instead, it finally lost. And for a banner that was on polls for 16 months, I mean, if anything, it's kind of impressive and it's pretty funny in some aspects, but it's really interesting seeing how far any sort of banner could have gone for any sort of revival poll whatsoever, because this is not something that you would ever see nowadays. The pace for power creep and skill creep is so huge that pretty much anything that would be on a revival poll by that point is most likely outdated by the 8 banners that came after it. It's that bad. Still, for 16 months and 9 total voting polls, I'll give them that. Pretty funny streak record. They did good for whatever it was. I don't miss it though. I think it just did inevitably hit its peak with all the other Book 5 banners because Book 5 was also a pretty large incline of power creep in general. We got stuff like Hardy Fighter, which was a really good skill and still really broken even to this day. Yuri, who was arguably one of the strongest, if not the strongest units in the game for his debut in a slight period of time after that. And then you also had the introduction of stuff like Lethality and a really good support unit and all sorts of other characters and skills that didn't really justify the original Book 4 midpoint banner for sticking around. But again, standards were fairly different back then than they are now, so it makes sense why it stuck around for a pretty decent bit. Not to the point where it was on 9 consecutive polls though, but I can guarantee you we are probably never going to see a streak like this ever again in FEH. If it is such a good banner, it's probably going to win, and if it sticks around for more than 1 poll, it's probably going to get kicked out in the next one because of how mediocre it is. I wouldn't say the same thing about Hall of Forms because 95% of the time you're only really grabbing a unit there that you like because 95% of them aren't really that good. Or I mean, probably 99% of them. Rarely do we end up getting something really, really strong, but that's a whole different beast of its own. Mirabilis banner, it was really nice knowing you. Never show your face again.